We could talk about the same belief. We could talk about a different belief. That's completely up to you. What I liked is that we had this long talk about spiritual trauma. And what's happened between that time is you've spent your third semester, at Divinity School. Well, it's a Divinity School social work
dual degree program. Yeah.
And you've had a lot of more exposure to the concepts we've been talking about. I'm just kind of curious how you've been through that. Is if maybe your belief is exactly the same, or maybe it's different. I don't know, but I think it's kind of neat that that's happened, and we can talk about that and see where we are. So the last time we talked, you brought to the table a belief about we are all experiencing spiritual trauma. I talked about this before, and so this is our second conversation, and I don't think that we need to go through. We went through a lot of definitions last time.
We did, yeah.
And if we need to, that's great, perfectly fine.
It might come up. We'll see.
Yeah, and I was going to people who are listening just to this one. If you want to hear, if you're not sure on what we're talking about, what the definition you brought up, go back to the first thing, and then you can hear what Ben was talking about. But we might revisit that. That's great.
Sure.
So, on a scale from 1 to 7, how confident are you that this belief is true?
It's interesting that I was wondering if this was going to be asked again, because I find that I'm pretty sure that I am more confident, but I don't think I would articulate it in a stronger number.
You're more confident?
Yeah, I think I would maintain a 5, because while I feel more confident, I also am more comfortable with the fact that even though I'm more confident, there is equally more potential that I might be wrong. And so I'm confident just from this past semesters of work and delving into the subject. But at the same time, I'm open to being wrong.
Okay, that's really interesting. So the last time you came on the show, that you were a 5 out of 7, and you're 5 out of 7 again, and you're thinking that you're more confident, but what's coinciding with that extra degree of confidence is more questioning.
I think it's just more humility in the fact that there's so much out there that we just don't know, and the more I learn, the more I realize that.
I also asked you, on a scale from 1 to 7, how important is it for you to believe in true things? Last time you said a 5 out of 7. This time...
Yeah. That made me think because I re-listened to that episode, and I was like, man, I don't know how I feel about that. Because in a way, who doesn't want to believe in true things, right? It seems like everybody would want to do that. And I still think I'm at a 5, but it's one of those things where I obviously want to believe in true things, but I don't think that when I believe something that is not true, that my whole self and worthiness will shift if I find that I am wrong. And so I think that I want to believe what is true, and I know that the nature of the brain works in such a way that I will often learn to think that something is certain, and then I will learn that it is not. Human beings are wired to want certainty.
Yeah.
And to want truth.
Yeah.
And I think that when we are so attached to that when we find that truth is no longer true, it can be really devastating. And so I think I'm just...
Yeah, what you say really, I think that resonates with, part of the motivation to do the show. So I think that's really interesting that you bring that up. Right off the bat, even, that you want it to be true. And are you saying that if this wasn't true, that it would be devastating to you, or? No,
I think that when I believe something is certain, and I find that my life is shaped around that certainty.
Right.
That when that rug is pulled out from under me, that experience is devastating.
Is that a potential for this belief, or is that another belief?
I think it would be a paradigm shift, but I don't know that it would be devastating.
So if this belief wasn't true, you wouldn't be a different person. You wouldn't
I would have a paradigm shift. I would be like, oh man, I've been going about this completely differently. I need to rethink this.
Yeah.
But I don't think I would like collapse, so to speak, mentally or otherwise.
Right. I gotcha. Well, we'll get to that then. Well, I think the natural question then is, you stated that you are more confident in the belief, and I'd love to know, how did you adjust your confidence level?
Yeah.
Obviously, you've learned something, something's happened to you, you've had an experience. I don't know if it's with the divinity school or outside, but something has happened where you have become more confident in the belief.
Yeah. So I would say I did one of my final projects for one of my classes was on trauma. That it was a self-directed study, and I chose to go with the trauma route. And I did a deep dive into Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score,
Okay.
which is about how trauma affects the body.
Okay.
And I've also been enjoying a lot of, I like to read, and I've been reading Hilary McBride's work, and she's a notable therapist from Canada who has done a lot of work with spiritual trauma specifically. And by engaging in their work, and then also through my classwork, engaging in systems and how we as human beings are inherently a part of a relational personhood.
Yeah.
And I think between learning and engaging with all of those things, that has raised my confidence level that we are being affected.
So you have had this belief in spiritual trauma, and you've read books through school and outside of school on spiritual trauma, and it has confirmed your thoughts and beliefs that this is true and real.
Yes, that sounds accurate.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So, a natural question would be, and that you've engaged in confirming a confirming process that's shown you that the belief is true and real. And I really want to know what you think here. Are we saying that it's the act of the confirming process, or there's something else? And what I'm saying is that, let's say, instead of reading books about spiritual trauma and telling you how, the elements of spiritual trauma and how that's real, there's probably, I don't know if there's any books out there that the whole purpose of the book is to say that spiritual trauma is not a thing, but I mean, probably not. But just as a thought experiment, do you think if you read those books, you would have a different belief, like disconfirming books? Or I'm trying to understand,
potentially it depends on how it's written and what the data and the research, because there's a lot of research that is backing these books, and lots of reference notes and all these studies. And
Sure.
Bessel van der Kolk's work is like 50 years in the making. I think it's just he's been doing this work for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And he's been able to track the progression of history. And so there's just a lot of data there. And if there is data that conflates and confutes and disagrees, then I'd love to see it.
Yeah, and this is just a thought experiment, and I don't pretend to know this research at all.
Yeah.
But if there was a disconfirming book, and you read the book and you saw how the studies were conducted, and they were conducted in a way that sufficient to you that this is how a study should be conducted, would you think that you would have a different confidence level, or do you think that your confidence level would still be where it is or higher?
I think a lot of what we do in graduate school is read opposing arguments about the same thing, actually. And we do it a lot. And I think one of the things that, in dealing with something that's as nebulous and mysterious, so to speak, as religion, means that in dealing with defining what God is, means that we're inevitably going to encounter paradox. And so there's this almost requirement that you need to be able to live with two things that are seemingly opposing, and yet they both exist. And so the question is, would I be able to grapple with the different data? Are they directly countering one another? Mm-hmm. Is it saying, no, this data is incorrect? Right. Or is it saying this is correct and this is correct? How do we deal and grapple with the fact that both? And I think it just depends on the type and the nature of the data and the nature of the studies that are being done. So I think there's a little bit more nuance there to determine, like, we need a little bit more specific understanding around what is coming about in that book or in that study.
Well, this is great. So help me out then. Help me ask the correct question. What would be a good opposing belief that opposes that we're all experiencing spiritual trauma or connected to somebody who is?
Yeah, I think it kind of hinges on the nature of personhood, actually. And am I and is my experience connected to yours?
The nature of personhood.
Yeah. And I think that there's probably more than this, but I'm aware of two, like, seemingly binary options for this in terms of what constitutes personhood, and that's like an isolated person and a relation person. So what constitutes personhood and what makes a person, which is a really fascinating question. But if I believe that we are relationally constituted, meaning who I am is determined and based and like necessarily contingent upon my being in relationship with another.
Who you are is based on who you are in relationship with other people. Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I think that a lot of the studies there stem from what makes a person in terms of, there's a lot of studies on infants, for instance, on when the baby prior to a certain point in development has no understanding that they are different from their parent or their mother or their caregiver.
Okay.
And so the relational constitution is who I am is determined in, like, I am necessarily must be in relationship before I can be an individual. But did a lot of research on people being relationally constituted this year. And so what that does is it implies that we're all in systems. And it directly means that we are one another. Connected to one another, rather.
So in your mind, you're telling me that the fact that we are relational beings mm-hmm. makes your belief true.
I would say that it is foundational to the belief that I hold. Yeah.
And if we were not relational beings, then that would be counter to your belief?
I believe so. And the other, that's one part of the binary. The other part of the binary stems from Descartes and, Cartesian anthropology, which is, stemming from I think, therefore I am, which mm-hmm. separates essentially mind and body. And it means that the self is not located in the body. And so being relationally constituted is not something that's going to happen in that kind of model. And so it separates the individual from the relationship in the body.
This is great. So there's two primary reasons you're giving me for support of your belief, why you think your belief is true. One is that we are relational beings, and if we were not relational beings or something to that effect, then that would make your you'd have less confidence in your belief. Mm-hmm. And the second thing is mind-body dualism.
So if there is that dualism,
okay,
then I believe that I would be less confident, I think.
So if there is mind-body dualism, then you'd be less confident in the belief.
I think so.
And
maybe, I think.
Okay. And if we were not relational beings, that would make you less confident in the belief. And I guess the corollary is you'd be more confident in the belief if we were even more relational beings. Mm-hmm. And you'd be more confident in the belief if there was even more evidence that mind-body dualism wasn't a thing.
Right? Maybe.
Okay.
I think we're close.
All right. Wow. This is getting abstract, so we'll have to.
Yeah,
All right.
Sorry. It's it gets into pretty deep philosophical questions.
This is great.
I think.
This is great because you've given me kind of two areas of why you believe what you believe, and that'd be useful to talk about, I think, and to explore. And by relational beings, does that maybe we should define that? It just means that we are just having relationships with other people?
I think who I am is intrinsically tied to who I am in relationship with.
Who you are is intrinsically tied to who you are in relationship with. How would, help me out, like how would being more of a relational person as opposed to less of a relational person make your belief more true versus less true?
I think that's an interesting question because I wonder if it is we either are or are not relational beings rather than a spectrum there. I think certainly I can be in more relationships with more people, but I think that by nature of being in a system that is inherently connected to, like if I have one relationship and that one relationship is with you, then I'm also, through being in relationship with you, in relationship with everyone that you're a part of. And therefore, everyone that they're a part of. And so what that does is it creates this mass system that we are all a part of in this world.
Could I live on a desert island and experience spiritual trauma?
That's an interesting question because there's a study that asks a very similar question. There was an orphanage, and this is a pretty devastating case study for a trigger warning, content warning. But essentially what happens is there were a bunch of children that were never put in contact with people. And they were raised essentially by like robots, and like there were not robots literally like walking around, but like they were fed mechanically and never had human touch.
Okay.
And so what that looked like then was like the question is, are they people? And that's a pretty interesting question because if we must be in relationship with another prior to developing a self, which is what some of these people who are making these studies are arguing. It's like, oh, that brings a very live question, and I don't claim to know the answer. I would want to argue that yes, that is what a person is. But then it comes into the question of, well, then when does a person become a person? Is it at conception? Is it at birth? Is it all of these things, which brings in a lot of other arguments. And so if someone is born on a desert island by themselves and they have no one there, but like what happened to, were they placed there? Like when did that happen? Did they grow up there? They left a while ago and now they're on our desert island. So that's my question.
Yeah.
What is the nature of this being on an island?
Right. And I think my question's maybe a little bit more narrowly focused in the sense that you're telling me that what makes spiritual trauma is this thing where we are in a relationship with other people. Mm-hmm. And I'm just trying to see, like, if someone was stranded on an island, if that person could still experience spiritual trauma, or are they experiencing some other kind of trauma, but maybe not spiritual trauma or some other kind of thing?
So I'm not sure I know how to articulate what's going through my head. I think one of the questions I have for that scenario is, what are the conditions upon which that person got stranded on that island? And how long did they exist prior to being stranded on this island? Does that make sense?
Would that... I'm trying to use your definition, because by definition, if they're on an island and they're by themselves, they're not in a relationship with other people.
So I'm hearing that... I'm hearing a difference in your question of being in relationship currently with other people.
Okay. And
being in relationship by nature of being.
So being in the past... So you could have been in a relationship in the past, mm-hmm. and that... Because of that...
Yeah.
Okay. Gotcha. All right. So it sounds like it'd be almost impossible not to be.
Relationally constituted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. That's yes. Well, and there are certainly degrees, right? Because and again, it hinges upon this argument of when does this occur and how, right? Which I don't know that I can articulate. I think that I can articulate and I confidently say that I believe we are relational. I don't know that I can articulately say when we become a person. That is a very live question.
Yeah, and I'm purposely not going there because that's well, that's not what you were saying was a primary reason why you believe the belief, and so that's. I think you're telling me that's not a great test, or I don't know what you're telling me. I think you're telling me that's a primary reason, but then you're telling me that reason will always be true.
Well, I'm hearing that. Yes. Well, I think that being stranded, okay, I'm 30. I'm going to be stranded on this island, which means I'm no longer in relationship with, right? But one of the things that is let's assume that that's true, right? But all the memories that we are carrying, right? And I think this might lead to another question. The memories that we're carrying of other relationships that we've been with, being a part of those relationships and who we are has been manipulated and shaped by who we have in the past been in relationship with. So when I go into this isolation mode, what's happening is I am still who I am. I am just no longer creating further relationship necessarily.
Well, let's say that I believe that Martians exist, and I'm not equating your belief with Martians, but let's say I believe that Martians exist because I am Mark Solomon. I couldn't think of a scenario in that case where I wouldn't or couldn't believe that Martians didn't exist because I'm always Mark Solomon. Mm-hmm. And are you telling me that with your reason that we are relational people, we're always relational people? So I think you're telling me that the reason always makes the belief true.
Two things come to mind, and I don't know if this answers your question. One, I think to clarify, when someone goes onto that desert island, if spiritual trauma past that point where they enter this island occurs elsewhere, this person on that desert island will not continue to be affected by the trauma that is outside of what they are in contact with.
Say it again.
So I'm on an island. Mm-hmm. I am no longer in relationship, have no connection to anyone, except my history.
Okay.
People continue to experience trauma. I am outside of relationship with those people.
Okay.
And so I'm not being affected by it.
Okay.
Does that help?
Right. So, in that sense, if you are on a desert island, this helps me, and you're no longer connected to people, then you would no longer experience spiritual trauma.
Yeah, and I think that it asks two questions, and I keep saying two, and I only kind of go into one because I keep forgetting, but so it goes. How big is the nature of what we're talking about? Because when I say all, right, worldwide, we are all being affected. I think that we are all being affected in such a way that by nature of being human,
right,
and therefore,
so if you're human, you're experiencing spiritual.
You're being affected by it because you're in this system that is inherently connected to everybody.
Yeah. So then, whether you're on a desert island or not really doesn't matter.
And I think one of the parts of that argument that also is the second half is that when you view that system as a piece of like as a whole system, as a unit, right? So every person as a part of a whole system, and one person is hurt.
Yeah.
What it's saying is that system is hurt.
Well, help me out here then, because I mean, you. This is your second time on, and you've heard the show, and you know how the show works.
Yeah.
So, let's go on a collaborative journey here, in the sense that I can't think of a way to disconfirm that first aspect of what you're telling me. Help me do that. And I'm not saying that we're saying that your belief is not true.
No. Yeah.
But it's an exercise to really, in a collaborative way, to, if we can maybe come up with a good disconfirming notion for your belief. In some ways, I think it would strengthen the belief.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And again, I'm totally fine with, like, let's disconfirm if it's not true. But I think the alternate, I think it's a very live argument, is individualism, and arguing that we are not inextricably connected to one another, right? That who I am is not dependent upon who you are. My choices are mine and my own. They are not affected by other people. I have full control. That is the opposite argument.
Let's assume that's the case. Let's assume we'll make that a premise, and we'll just make that a premise that, and not even to discuss the truth value of that, which is a separate, separate thing. But we'll say, just for the purposes of this conversation, the premise is we are independent people. That what I do is what I do. It affects me. What you do is you do. It affects you. We don't affect each other. Does that necessarily, if that was true, does that necessarily...
If that were true, I think spiritual trauma would still be true.
Oh, it'd still be true.
But I don't think we would all be affected by it.
Okay.
I think...
I'm having trouble coming up with any disconfirming criteria for the belief.
Yeah.
And I'm looking to you, because you know the belief better than I do, and you're okay with it. I mean, I think, to be honest with you, sometimes when I talk to people, when I'm talking about disconfirming stuff, it's it can be a little bit too close to the bone.
Too close to home. Yeah.
Too close to the home.
Could,
is it close to home?
Pull the rug out.
Yeah.
Right.
and so it's sometimes it's a little difficult to talk about. But I think you seem fine with it, and I just was curious if I'm trying to think of something that would...
Well, and I think I might be not good at this, because I have also, like, I'm naturally going to have this confirmation bias, because as I have done this research, I have held this belief.
Right.
And so, let's acknowledge that and realize that that's a part of this conversation.
And it's part of human experience.
And
just to be clear that,
So, but again, I think that it's foundationally, like, this whole belief is foundational. I'm mincing these words. It depends upon us being relational humans, meaning that we are affected by one another. And I think that part of that argument also depends on what is the extent to which that that relationship with others affects us, because that's also what's happening is it's creating this absolute, right? Where, like, because this exists, like, you can't refute it, right? But I think part of the research that still needs to be done is it true that I am being affected by someone on the other side of the world, right? And it depends, and that hinges upon, do we believe that we're a part of this system that is inherently connected?
But even if you are
being
affected by somebody on the other side of the world, or not affected by somebody on the other side of the world, I think you're telling me that spiritual trauma is still a thing.
Oh, it's a thing everywhere.
Right.
Yeah.
And so...
anywhere where there is spirituality or religion.
Yeah. So, it seems like no matter how we look at this, that this is a true belief because it couldn't not be a true belief.
As
Right?
as long as we are relational,
Could
right?
we be relational people and spiritual trauma not be a thing?
Yes, if spirituality were no longer a thing, but I don't know how to undo that either.
Could we be relational people and spirituality not be a thing? And we might have to define that, what spirituality is to you.
I don't know how to answer that question because I don't think as the way the world is, I don't think so.
What is spirituality?
Believing in something that is greater than ourselves, that is grounded in love or kindness for other people. So believing in a power that is greater than us, that is connecting people and is grounded in love. That's a very base, probably not well articulated definition. But again, going back to that first episode from Brene Brown.
So love and connectedness.
Yeah.
In a higher power, whatever we say that is.
Yep. So, and again, I'm intentionally not saying God because that's not language for everybody. But
is there a supernatural component to it, or is it? Could I be?
I don't think it needs to be.
I could be spiritual and not have just be all grounded in the physical.
Yeah, I think that if you ask someone from any particular religious background, they will say that no, this is God, or this is this, or this is this. For me, I think that a value can be larger than me. Like the value of love is bigger than me, right?
Okay.
And me loving other people is, I think, love is greater than I am in that it exists beyond me. And I'm inextricably connected to other people through love, right? And so that is one way one could articulate it. Another one might say that we are connected through God, or any other
Yeah, and I
possible
I just want
option.
to, and either definition is fine with me. I just wanted to work off we're talking about the same thing. And for you, spirituality is love, and it's a higher power, but not necessarily a supernatural higher power. And
Yeah. It's just greater than any individual.
right. Like tell me, like, for you, what is that higher power then? So I can understand.
I'm still trying to figure that out.
Because you see, I'm getting, because we're digging down, and it seems, and I like this because the more we go, it seems like it's more hinging on this idea that this assumption that a spirituality is a thing and that thing exists, and that thing propels this notion of spiritual trauma.
Yeah.
And I think you're telling me that that's a real core belief, like a super core belief of yours.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to know how you see it, like, because I've heard spirituality being defined many different ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for you, I'm trying to understand this higher power component.
Yeah.
I think maybe if I understood that, I could maybe see where you're coming from.
Yeah, this is another situation where I feel comfortable not knowing. So that probably makes it more complicated. But I think that I think I would call it God, but I think the semantic field for God is too large to say that, is it the same God that we say God in the Pledge of Allegiance? I don't know that it is. Is it the same God that Christianity claims? I don't know that it is. Is it like And so when I say God, it is very different than the connotation it carries.
So for you, is God, but maybe not necessarily a God like in a formal religion kind of God.
Correct. Yeah. And I think I don't know how to define that.
Does a person have a personal relationship with this God? Is it a God that does things for people that you can talk to, or is it a force, an energy? I mean,
It's a great question. I don't know. So this is getting into theology, right? This is what is my theology, and
it seems like so core for you. It's really
it's core. Well, I think it's core to the belief, but it's also like this is a question that no one's been able to answer over the course of ever, and at least satisfactorily without like critique and things along those lines. So even if I were to come up with an answer, I don't know that I would feel comfortable with saying this is it.
So you're saying that it's a strong belief that you have. It's difficult to articulate.
Yeah, so I can say that.
How do you know it?
I don't.
Okay.
That's I think what's hinging upon it. I don't. And I think that's
a fair
where this
response.
like this belief exists, and that's what like faith is, right?
Yeah.
I believe this, but I don't know. Like
Yeah.
it's like I don't think, and honestly, I don't think that when people claim that they do know, I think it gets dangerous. It's like,
and I see where you're coming from. And I say you're saying you don't know, and that's absolutely fair. A fair response.
yeah. Thank you.
I wish. Well, honestly, I wish more people would say, "Tell me," or I'd tell myself, or people around the world would say they don't know things when they don't happen to know things.
Yeah.
And that seems like a fair response. I guess the only thing I would wonder then is, and it might be the case, but you're saying that your confidence level is at a 5.
Yeah.
Do you think that is a appropriate place to have a confidence level for something you don't know?
That's an interesting question.
Because it seems like if I didn't know something, and well, I'll just let you respond.
I think that's an interesting ethical question, actually, because much of the world is operating on a 7 when it comes to this question. Like, very confident it is true.
I would suspect that's the case.
And I mean, just like think about just any religious rhetoric that you hear, and maybe not any, but much, especially in the United States in evangelical culture. Again, my education is primarily Christian, so I'm coming with a lot of that as a background.
And to be fair, you're not saying you're at a 7. You're saying you're at a 5.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
And 4 is,
And like what changes about? I think that's what I'm trying to figure out for myself is what changes if I say 4 instead of 5. And I don't know that nothing is lost by saying 4 instead of 5. And I think it's more of an honesty question and maybe a lack of consideration rather than this is where I feel I am. But like maybe it is a 4. Right. And maybe it is like I'm truly neutral on the fence because that's like the middle. Right. It's like I really don't know. It could go one way or the other. And maybe that is what it is. But I would say that because of my personal experience, it feels more like a 5. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Right. So are we separating kind of an intellectual argument or what you tell yourself, which may be at a 4, and separating that what feels to be true, which is more of a 5? I don't try to words in your mouth.
Yeah. That feels... I don't feel uncomfortable with the way you describe that.
Yeah. No, and I think that seems very honest to me that we have beliefs.
So.
Well, we just have beliefs that are that often might feel to be more or less true than what it is true.
Yeah.
It could be feel that it's more true than it is, or feel that it's even, or go the other way, feel it's less true than it is.
Yeah. And I like again, much of my studies is this exact question. It's theology. What is God? How and how to what how who what how when is God?
And for you, it boils down to I think you mentioned faith.
Yeah, well, and I think that's I believe that God is. I do not know that I can claim anything specific more. like you know, like
But
I
when
can
you think, how do you know the entity is true? What do you tell yourself?
Can you rephrase that?
Yeah, I think you believe that God is true in your conception of God, and there is probably a primary way you know that is more true than not true.
I would say the more I read, the more I don't know. Like it is a very. This is a very live question for me.
Yeah.
I'm at once becoming more confident and like feeling like this is something that I can come closer to describing, and at the same time I am like realizing how vast this conversation is around like defining and understanding what God is, right?
Yeah, and I, when I'm asking these questions, I just want to make it clear that I don't have the answers.
Yeah. Me either.
And but I do find it extremely fascinating that you're in divinity school and
Me too.
And you have these, I often, just to be completely honest, I've talked to at this point quite a few people who are in divinity school or have been in divinity school and even the very specific divinity school that you go to, and more often than not, they're at a 7, and then some.
Yeah. Well, and again, I think this is me in using my caveat. I think that anytime we become certain, it's dangerous.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to theology and God.
Well,
and again,
let me ask you this. You're in a dual degree program of divinity and social work.
Yeah, that's correct.
Why aren't you just in a divinity program? What is social work bringing? What's the extra that social work is bringing that divinity is not bringing to the table?
I would flip that and say, why am I doing divinity?
I was going to do that.
Right? Because the reason I'm in school is for the social work portion.
Yeah.
My end goal for me as professional is to be a therapist. And I want to work with people who are experiencing trauma. That is the area and niche that I want to tackle.
Trauma or spiritual trauma?
Trauma. And I am in divinity school to be able to speak well to spiritual trauma.